Well, good evening, and welcome to the first public forum of CTNS for the year 2011. I'm Bob Russell, the founder and director of the Center of Theology and Math Sciences, and I'm the Ian G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here in residence at the GTU. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this forum. The mission of CTNS, as most of you know very well, is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science. And we do it through programs of research, teaching, and public service. So today, for example, our guest speaker will join a class that Adam and I are teaching, and we've had a great conversation with students there. And tonight is the public service, public forum. And in the past, when our guest has been here, we also had a research conference about his work. If you're interested in finding out more about CTNS or would like to consider joining in getting our free journal, Kyle, if you want to raise your hand, you can talk to Kyle after the conference and get some feedback. Okay, we also have books for sale at a discount, $10 each. I think you may find some interesting ones. So take a look afterwards and see what you have. The seating speaker is Dr. George Ellis. George is Emeritus Professor of Applied Mathematics at Cape Town University, South Africa. As you probably saw from the flyer, George is immensely well published in a variety of fields. His seminal work, I actually bought and tried to read. Very complicated book. When I was doing a PhD in physics, and I brought it along to show you that I actually own the book. I understand the book. The large-scale structure of space-time, Stephen Hawking and George Ellis. George is a postdoc with Steve, and this is a textbook, a landmark textbook in the field. And if you look inside, you'll actually see notes where I finally got it. I actually paragraph them in. So that represents one side of it. He's a distinguished cosmologist, astrophysicist, applied mathematician, and has just made an immense career out of that. George is also a serious Quaker, very serious about his Quaker faith, his Quaker experience, and that led him to be very much a leader in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and has continued his participation in the Quaker movement. We've had some wonderful conversations over conferences about nonviolence, whether our country could adopt it and not just the first of our people. So it's this wonderful part of George's world, which I very much respect and appreciate. George has been involved with CTNS for 15, 20 years now. We had a series of conferences with the Vatican Observatory, and it led to a series of publications, the so-called Scientific Perspectives on Divine Action. The first conference was on quantum cosmology and laws of physics, laws of nature, and George contributed to that immensely, and has been involved in a variety of those conferences through that whole process. George was here as the J.K. Russell Fellow in 1994. That's the program where you have the research conference, the public service events like this, going out to churches and stuff, and then teaching a course. So George has been very much a friend and supporter of CTNS. And in 2004, if I'm right, George won the Temple Prize, and that is, of course, extremely impressive reflection of the importance of his work to an international audience on the creative dialogue between theology and science. One more thing to show you. This is such an icon for me in so many ways. The book is called On the Moral Nature of the Universe. On the Moral Nature of the Universe. The argument is if you're going to try to talk about the universe is fine-tuned for life, what's really important about life isn't just intelligence, but moral capacity, right? And altruism, virtue. So his point is, and he wrote Nancy Murphy, that in fact, a universe which can produce creatures capable of nonviolence, of kenosis, of altruism, is a very unique universe. Right? So even more unique than the universe in which life is capable. A particular kind of life, this kind of life. Picture of Dresden, 95% bombed in the war. Right? And the horror of being a moral agent, because we so horribly mess up as one. This is also an icon because it represents the kind of collaboration that makes me proud to see and to support. George and Nancy Murphy wrote this together. Now, formally, George is a applied mathematician, cosmologist. Nancy Murphy is a distinguished, or at this time she's up-and-coming, now distinguished philosopher and theologian. She got a PhD right here at the GTU. I was on a committee. She's just a phenomenal person. They met as colleagues at the Secret Vatican series, and this book came out of it. It's one of the best books in the field. If you haven't read On the Moral Nature of the Universe, I really highly recommend it to you. And it shows what this kind of intimate collaboration between people from very different walks of life, right? Very different professional trainings can produce. They can produce a splendid volume which appears to be single author. It's almost seamless. And it reflects the kind of synthetic work that I think is really what Seek is trying to promote, and I'm proud to see it happening. So we have doctoral students in the room. Go home and do likewise, my children. George is a dear person. I accepted the event. When I first heard about him, it was through this large-scale structural space-time he wrote with Stephen Hawking. So I had no idea what he was like as a person, but I was incredibly impressed with his intellectual power. I mean, that book is really something. When I got to know him at the Vatican Observatory, I found out here's a fellow person of faith. He's walking the journey of faith. He's a wonderful human being for whom Quaker faith is really integral to the way he approaches his work, his life, his attitudes, his politics, his relationships. And it was just such a joy for me, because usually in physics you don't talk about, are you Jewish or Christian or Muslim? You just you're a physicist. You just do that and you put the rest aside. But George immediately began to talk about his faith experience, and that was from then on. I mean, I felt so much at home with someone who had been an intellectual mentor for me. Now became a kind of spiritual companion as well. So it's just been a pleasure to know these almost 20 years now. And to welcome back to GQ and introduce you to my dear friend, George Ellis.
Well, thank you for that somewhat embarrassing introduction. And it's very good to be back here. I have, as you've heard, been here on a number of occasions, and it's good to be back. So what I wanted to talk about today is, why is the universe the way it is? What underlies the laws that shape it? And I've got to start off with, one can start this from a scientific viewpoint and from a humanistic viewpoint, and the question is, how do you fit them together? And you may or may not know about this painting by Paul Gauguin. And up at the top left-hand corner there, you can't read it, but I've reproduced it there. It says, where do we come from, what are we, and where are we going? It's one of Paul Gauguin's most famous paintings. So he is asking the same questions, in a sense, as we're asking. And the question is, how does this humanistic question from an outstanding artist relate to the way that a scientist sees things? So the deep issue in both cosmology and human life is, what is it that underlies the existence of those laws of nature which define the possibility space within which the universe and life comes into being? Because what happens in the cosmos and what happens in nature is based on the laws of physics, the laws of nature, which underlie how we come into being. They define what I call a possibility space. And that's one way of talking about things. The laws of physics tell us, for instance, that when you're playing football or tennis or driving an automobile, you have to obey the laws of conservation of energy, the laws of conservation of momentum. And so you can do many, many things are possible, but what you can't do is violate the possibility space. And where does that possibility space come from? It comes from the laws of physics which underlie the large-scale structure and the small scale. Now, the question is, why do such laws exist? Why do any such laws exist? Why do they have the nature they have, which leads to our physical and mental existence? And as a cosmologist, it's very, very easy to imagine universes in which the laws of physics are different and in which no life at all would be possible. And one of the things I think we've established quite clearly in the past couple of decades is that the universe in which we do live is a very, very special one, in the sense that in the space of possible universes, most of them would not allow any life to exist at all. Is the reason these laws exist and allow us to come into being, is it pure chance, is it probability, is it necessity, or is it purpose? And I will come back to that later on. And furthermore, is the nature of the laws of physics prescriptive? Does it control what happens, or is it descriptive? Do they describe what happens? And this is a deep philosophical question which we have been debating, we will continue to debate, and we're probably never going to solve. We want to understand the existence and nature of the causal laws that allow complexity to come into existence. It's an evolving universe that allows galaxies, stars, planets, and life to come into being. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about complexity. It's something I've thought about a lot. The laws allow modular hierarchical structures. Each of those words is really important. We're made out of little modules. Each of us is made in particular out of cells. We're each made out of 10 to the 13th little cells, which all knit together in a hierarchical way. And so the cells form limbs, the limbs fit together to form the body, there are systems and so on. And they are structures. It's really important. The whole thing is structured. We only are the way we are because we have very, very specific structuring which underlies our functioning. It's these things which allow emergence of complexity. And one must realize when one thinks of complexity, there are three different ways in which complexity comes into existence. Firstly, in evolutionary terms, in very long time scale, if you go back to the start of the universe, there were no complex structures. There was simply hydrogen and later helium. There wasn't any carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. There weren't any human beings, certainly. On a time scale of billions of years, and then eventually the Earth came into being, then evolution on Earth took billions of years again. And so there are very, very long time scales in which the initial structure of the universe, which is just hydrogen and helium, eventually turns into the beings that we see in this room. The second way in which complexity comes into being is in developmental terms. And each of us was once a single cell. And that cell started dividing, divided until it was 10 to the 13th cells. And the time scale involved here is, in the case of human beings, about 20 years. And so each of us started off as a single cell, which was complex at a certain level, but nothing like the complexity that then evolves into in a human being. And the third way in which complexity emerges is in functional terms. Each of us is made up out of atoms, the atoms form together to form molecules, the molecules form together to form biomolecules, which form cells, and so on. The lower levels of our structure, the atoms do not live in any sense. It is only when they're assembled into a living being that the atoms start in some sense to live. So the laws of physics that we have allowed complexity to emerge in evolutionary terms in the universe, forming galaxies, stars and planets, and then on Earth, the whole process of Darwinian evolution. In developmental terms, in each of our lives on a time scale of about 20 years, and then in functional terms on time scales of minutes and seconds. So the stars on the one hand came into being, and the planets, that galaxy has about 100,000 million stars in it, and probably there are at least 100,000 million planets there, but we can't actually see them. So the hierarchy of structure, on the physics side, particle physics underlies atomic physics, underlies physical chemistry, materials, geology, space science, astronomy, and cosmology. And that is the hierarchy of structure. But there is the living side as well. And on the living side, it is particle physics underlies atomic physics, underlies chemistry, underlies biochemistry, underlies cell biology, underlies botany, zoology, physiology, underlies psychology, underlies sociology, economics, and politics. And one of the most amazing things is that one, the bottom three are the same on both sides. In other words, living matter and non-living matter are made out of the same basic structure at the particle physics level, at the atomic physics level, and at the simple chemistry level. And that is truly extraordinary. That, of course, is one of the major discoveries, is that life is not made out of any special substance. It's made out of the same substance as non-living things. Now, this hierarchy is based at the lowest level in physics, as I've just shown. So it is basic physical laws that allow us to come into existence, that allow this emergence in these three different timescales. And so we can spend a lot of time, I don't know how many of you are physicists, talking about the specific family of particles that exist. and interact through 4 fundamental forces based on principles of quantum mechanics. These can be described by variation principles with fundamental symmetries that entail conservation laws. There are specific masses and interaction strengths in this hierarchy. Special relativity is in there, structuring what happens. The exact symmetries are broken, which allows masses and complexity to come into existence, and it all takes place in a 4-dimensional space-time. And we can talk a great deal about this, but this isn't going to be a physics lecture. What I do want to say is that at each level of the hierarchy, complexity, universal principles apply, and I think they can be best thought of in Platonic terms. Each level exists in its own right, even though it is based in the lower levels, and the laws at that level are effective laws deriving from action at a lower level. At the level at which cells come into existence, you can talk about the nature and existence of cells without having to understand particle physics, without having to understand atomic physics, because the laws are effective laws at that level, even though they derive from what happens at lower levels in the hierarchy of complexity. And what is important, the way the laws work out is shaped by the higher level context in which they act, which leads to effective laws at each level, which I regard as ontologically real. Just what I mean by that, for instance, I think that computer is real. Now, the computer is made out of atoms, which are made out of neutrons and electrons. So if you're a real reduction, you say, hang on, that computer's not real, it's only the atoms that are real. Or maybe the atoms aren't real, maybe it's only the particles, the electrons and protons that are real, and so on. My view is that each level is real, that the atoms are real, but the computer is also real. Okay, and at a certain level, this is a philosophical position which seems to me obvious, and I'm not going to discuss it any further. These laws control what happens at that level in a way independent of time and place and independent of our understandings and descriptions. If I take this computer over to Alpha Centauri, a completely different time, if it was to exist 1 million years in the future, it would still function in exactly the same way, because the laws of physics are the same at each time and place, and the emergent laws at each level are the same at each time and place. So in this hierarchy, what I'm saying is I think we can think of each level as a real level. And so cell biologists talk about a level which is a real level of causation. Botanists talk about a level which is a real level of causation. Psychologists are talking about a level which is a real level of causation. It is influenced from below, but it's real at its own level. So bottom-up action is when what happens at the higher levels is controlled by what happens at the lower levels. So microphysics underlies macrophysics. And this is the famous discoveries of about 100 years ago, the kinetic theory of gases explaining the pressure and temperature of gases, the theory of solids explaining heat conduction, thermal capacity, and so on. That's one of the triumphs of physics. Physics underlies chemistry. One of the great discoveries of the last century was the nature of the chemical bond and how chemical bonding is based in physics. Protein folding and recognition, discovered in the late part of last century, is based on the chemical bonding. That allows cells with their own internal functioning to underlie all life, and so cells underlie the way we function, because we're each made of cells, as I've already said, and it's the fact that those cells are working the way they do which allows us to exist. Physics and chemistry underlie the functioning of the brain. This century is going to be the century of the brain and the understanding of neurosciences and how neurons fit together, the action potentials and so on, to make the brain work. And of course, individual human behavior underlies the functioning of society. In each case, this is bottom-up action in the hierarchy of complexity. And if you only consider bottom-up causation alone, your belief is that each level determines what happens above. Microforces determine what happens at the high levels. That's the foundation of high-level activity. Well, that's true, but it's a partial truth. Because there's also top-down action. There certainly is bottom-up, but there's also top-down action, which is in the higher levels of the hierarchy causally affect what happens at the lower levels in a coordinated way. And there's multiple top-down action, as well as the bottom-up action. And it's this top-down action that enables complexity to come into being. And this is part of the reason why the simple reductionist position is not true. It's because there's top-down action coordinating what happens at the lower levels, giving them a causal effectiveness. It's prevalent in the real physical world and in biology because no real physical or biological system is isolated. Boundary effects linking the system to the environment, as well as structural relations, affect top-down action. Now let me give you, so this is bottom-up, is in fact altered, there's top-down as well, and this enables feedback loops between the levels, and it's these feedback loops between the higher and lower levels that enables genuine complexity to come into existence. So I can give you many examples, but let me give you one specific example of top-down action. Natural selection, the Darwinian process that we've heard so much about, is a top-down procedure because the development of the DNA codings in each of our cells, the particular sequence of bases in the DNA, takes place through an evolutionary process which adapts the organism to its niche. And we know about that. That's the basic Darwinian process. Now that's a case of top-down action from the environment to detailed biological microstructure. Through the process of Darwinian adaptation, based on random mutations, the environment, with other factors, fixes the specific DNA coding. And my point is there's no way you can predict the DNA coding on the basis of biochemistry and microphysics alone. You're wasting your time if you go to a physicist and say, please will you tell me what will be the DNA coding in a zebra? I couldn't be able to tell it to you. You can't even ask the appropriate questions in the language of physics, or even of chemistry, or even of biochemistry. Adaptive selection is how new information comes into biological processes, and it's unpredictable because a random element enters. Now let me make this clear with an example. Here's a polar bear. The environment is this polar environment. In effect, that environment says to the animal, if you want to survive, it's better for you to be white than to be brown. And if you were in the Canadian forests, you would be brown rather than white, but in fact the environment says there's a niche for white animals and there's not a very good niche for brown animals. Through the processes of adaptation, in effect, I almost use the word the environment teaches the DNA sequences. You better produce a brown animal rather than a white animal in order for this thing to survive. Through natural selection, top-down action from the environment codes information about appropriate response of the environment into the detail-based sequences. And how do you know it's top-down action? Well, because if you change the environment, you change the animal, you change the outcome at the DNA sequence level. If you were to compare the DNA of this white bear with the brown bear, you're going to find differences at some points in the DNA. And so what happens is the ecological context influences the actual detail coding. That's top-down action from the macro scale down to the very detailed micro scale. I'll give you three more examples. This is some light elements in the early universe for those who are interested in cosmology. At very, very early stages in the universe, there was nothing but hydrogen and helium. And then, as the universe expands, it produced helium, so the current universe on a large scale is 25% helium and 75% hydrogen of the largest scales. The amount of helium produced depends on the rate of change of temperature in the universe, and that's controlled by the gravitational equations and the average amount of matter in the universe. That is a macro variable. The amount of matter controls the rate of expansion, controls the rate at which temperature changes. So this macro quantity determines the way the nuclear reactions take place, and that determines the amount of helium produced. So quantities defined at the macro level, the cosmological level, control the details of the micro reactions and nuclear reactions at the micro level. And that's one example. Another one, those of you who know how computers work, artificial neural nets. These are a model of the way that our brain works. They perform a specific task, letter recognition. You know that there are now many signature recognition and letter recognition computers that work all around us. How do they work? They work through an artificial neural net. Now, in the net there are basically, in effect, layers of neurons which are connected to each other, and the strength of the connections is determined by training the artificial neural network. What you do is you showed, if you wanted to recognize letters, you showed A's, B's, C's and so on, and you train it to tell it whether you've got it correct, you're seeing an A, or no, you're wrong, you think it's an A, but actually it's a D. This is a form of top-down causation from the pattern to be recognized, because the pattern of an A or the pattern of a D is not a physical thing, it's an abstract thing. That abstract concept, a high-level concept, it's defined as a relation between the elements and the letters, acts down through the process of training the neural network to the properties of network weights, which is a micro-property of the neural network. Decision-making then is a property of the network rather than the cell. And why this is important is because this is a model of the way that our brains recognize things and learn things as well. And so, of course, one crucial example of the top-down causation is the power of the mind in the real world. And this aircraft would not exist if in our bodies there wasn't a top-down causation from the level of the mind through to the level of the muscles in our hands, which then press the keys on the computer's keyboard or write or so on. This jumbo jet aircraft is a product of the human mind, and I can only get impatient with philosophers who say the mind does not have causal effects. The mind does have causal effects. There is a demonstration of the causal effects of the mind. What I want to emphasize here, at many of the levels of complexity, many different timescales, there's a Darwinian type of logic which underlies this functioning, in which the higher level selection principles choose between a range of lower level options whose existence represents both statistical chance and irreducible quantum uncertainty. Underlying the way biology works is uncertainty, fluctuations at the bottom level. It's those fluctuations that are uncertainty. This allows a higher level selection principle to guide what happens. That enables information to become a crucial causal determinant at the biological level. It's what's happening in evolution. The universe started off, in the early universe, there wasn't any biological information. Where did it come from? It came through the Darwinian processes of adaptive selection. This then enables the higher level entities to have genuine causal power over lower levels because there's these fluctuations. And plausibly, it's this kind of adaptive process which allows intelligent agency to take place and consequent responsibility to be genuine. Because in fact, the process of learning is a process of adaptive selection also. We learn that some things work and some things don't. We adapt our behavior. So a core thing in all of this way that this complexity occurs and functions is adaptive selection, the Darwinian type of logic applied in a very wide set of contexts. At the bottom, so what I've been talking about is the top-down part of what's going on, but of course there's the bottom-up stuff going on as well. At the bottom, impersonal dynamical principles operate. They operate on material entities in a space-time. And if you didn't have these regularities, life wouldn't happen, because we want life to be reliable. So we want reliable laws to underlie what happens. And those are the laws of physics. And these laws give you stars, galaxies, planets, and life. Now, this can only happen if they are precisely ordered, involving relationships and processes governing the behavior of the matter. One of the famous questions about these laws is, why are they so well described by mathematics? Those of you who've done simple physics will know that the laws of gravity is an inverse square law, one of the simplest possible laws one can imagine. If they were different, the solar system would be unstable. But the question here is not why is the inverse square law, why is it a mathematical law? It's one of the things which people have pondered for a long time. Now, at one level, you can say, well, the laws of physics are describing reliable patterns. Mathematics describe patterns, so perhaps the mathematics describe patterns, the laws of physics are ways of creating ordered patterns. Maybe it's not surprising that mathematics describe the laws of physics, because that's the very nature of mathematics. It describes patterns. It describes patterns in space and in time, and it describes patterns in patterns, which leads to recursion and higher order relationships. Well, I'm not going to go into that one any further. The question is, at the fundamental level, what's the nature of these laws of physics? Are they prescriptive? In other words, are they somehow written in a Platonic space from which they control the nature of existence? If so, where are they written and how do they control the nature of existence? For instance, Electromagnetism, these lights in this room, radios, televisions, are all based on Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism. Are those laws forcing electromagnetism to behave in a certain way, or do they describe how electromagnetism happens to behave? That's one of the questions which we've spent a lot of time thinking about. If they're prescriptive, then in some sense they have to be a mathematical description somewhere, somehow embodied into some kind of space, which then tells the laws how to function. And people have puzzled over this. What's the relation between mathematics and physics? Incidentally, the book I can really recommend on this is some of the writings of my colleague Roger Penrose. He's written very nicely about this. If this is the way things go, if the laws of physics are prescriptive, then in some sense they existed before the universe existed. And I think many of my colleagues really think this, although they don't usually say this. As with Stephen Hawking's latest book, he says that the laws of physics made it inevitable things would be the way they are. Now, he doesn't state that, but he somehow apparently thinks that the laws of physics pre-exist the universe. They existed before. Where did they exist? How did they exist? Well, he must be thinking, even if he doesn't say so, that they exist in some platonic realm of abstract existence with causal powers over the universe as it comes into being. That seems to be the kind of picture which he's implying. The alternative view is that the laws of physics are descriptive. They just tell you that matter has certain behavior and the laws just describe it. Matter just has certain ways of behaving. The laws that we love are phenomenological. In other words, they just are descriptions at a certain level of what happens. And a lot of people believe that's the way, but if so, you have a really fundamental puzzle. Why is the behavior of matter the same at all times and in all places as it seems to be? We've got evidence from astronomy that matter was behaving the same way 14 billion years ago and at a distance of 14 billion light years away, incredible times and spaces far away. Astronomy is telling us matter was the same there as it is here and now. If you don't have somehow a set of laws which control how matter behaves, but you just have matter somehow behaving, why does it behave the same way at all times and in all places? That becomes a really strange kind of problem, particularly because some of the matter over there has never had any causal contact with the matter over there. So why should it behave in the same way when there's no possible causal correlation between them? Well, I tend to go the prescriptive way. I know some of my colleagues tend to go the descriptive way. At a theological level, one can say perhaps the laws are written in the mind of God. If that helps you understand things, that's good. If it doesn't, that's okay. At a certain level, that may be, in some sense, a valid description of what is going on here. In that case, is God a mathematician or just someone who thinks of how things behave and the mathematics follows? In any case, given suitable lowest level laws with restricted structure and restricted coupling constants described in a nice way by Paul Davies in his books, a hierarchy can emerge. But whether we think of these laws as prescriptive or descriptive, whether we think of the behavior of matter as governed by them or described by them, still the question is what underlies the effective laws at the lowest level? Why do they exist with the form they have? And why do they allow complexity to emerge? Because the crucial thing which is clear, if you mess around with those laws in very small ways, complexity won't emerge. For instance, there's a relation between the electric force and the nuclear force. The nuclear force holds nuclei together, the electric force governs electromagnetism. If you play around as a theoretical physicist with those relative strengths, you find the ratio has to lie in an incredibly small range, otherwise matter, complex matter, can't exist. And so on. There are many, many ways in which those laws have to be restricted in order that we come into existence. So, is that fact that the laws exist in such a way which allows us to come to existence? This is a physics question. Is it pure chance, probability, necessity, or purpose. Sorry, it's a physics-based question, but it's a philosophical question. And I'm going to consider these in turn. Some people believe the laws of physics are the way they are by pure chance. Now that doesn't mean probable. The word chance there might mislead you into thinking I'm saying it's probable. I'm not saying it's probable. I'm saying it's just pure happenstance. This is just the way it was. This view isn't saying it's probable. It's just saying it just is what happened. It's not saying it's probable. It's saying this is what happened and there's nothing more to say. Now, I know some people who think this is the way it is, who support this view. It's a logically possible ultimate reason. It's logically, if you say this is my position, nobody can say it's logically, doesn't make sense. It does make sense logically. But it has no further explanatory power. So if this is just the way things are, all you can say is that's all it is, and there's nothing more to do. As a scientist, you give up at this point and say, I can't do any more science. As a theologian, you give up and say, there's nothing more to say. Indeed, this is a denial that there's a fundamental level there is any explanation. It's a statement there is no explanation. That's really what this viewpoint is. Well, that means it's unsatisfactory to more or less everyone, whether scientifically or religiously inclined. And in fact, most scientists don't like this. I do know a couple of scientists who take this viewpoint, but most people don't like that. And that's primarily because we do know that explanations do exist in the social and mental world. And so if you were to really pursue this, you'd say there isn't any underlying explanation, but it has led to explanations coming into existence. Okay? My primary school motto was ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing can be made. And I think actually that applies here. I don't believe there's any plausibility whatever that if things happen just by chance, this is just the way it was, that it could have led to the complexity of existence that we see in this room. I don't believe that. But of course that's just a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement. So it's difficult to resist the argument that the outcome that we see is so unlikely that pure chance in this sense is simply not credible as a reason. Not only are senses come into existence, qualia, feelings, emotions, but also theories such as Einstein's theory of relativity, quantum field theory, have come into existence as extraordinarily complex theoretical constructs. To suggest that these can all arise without existence of any underlying cause, or can come into existence out of pure chaos or nothingness without any further guiding structure, seems to be simply absurd. Okay? If you have such a cause or guiding structure, you don't have pure chaos or nothingness. So, this is a philosophical argumentation. I'm not arguing at a sophisticated philosophical level. I'm arguing as a practicing scientist. I don't think it makes sense. Probability. Now, for the scientist, probability trumps lack of any explanation. And most scientists in cosmology would like to say that the universe we see around us is probable, and they would like somehow to make that happen. But probability by itself is always an incomplete explanation, because you explain probability in terms of certain laws and certain assumptions. So what underlies the laws that govern the probabilities? Where do those come from? This is of course just the thing you can always keep following causation back. You can do complex calculations to obtain the probabilities, but why are the assumed laws underlying these probabilistic calculations valid in the first place? Okay? So if you start asking the fundamental questions, where do the laws come from, you have to ask that for the probabilistic laws just as much as anything else. Where do those probabilistic laws come from? In any case, probability is a good explanation for intermediate levels of explanation, but there's no evidence it applies in the context of ultimate causation. Indeed, the very concept of probability is not applicable if there's only one object, only one universe in existence. If there's only one universe, probability simply doesn't apply, because probability applies when you have a set of things to apply it to. Now, when I was young, it was taken for granted there is, on the scientific side, there's one universe. That's what the universe means. U is uni, one. And of course, nowadays people are liking to talk about a multiverse, claiming that there are out there hundreds of thousands, millions, even people are talking a lot about an infinite number of other universes out there. Now, if it is true, there is in physical existence an infinity or a very large number of other universes out there, then you've got a multiverse, and in that case, you can use probability arguments. And so, many of my colleagues are following this hypothesis that there's a multiverse and in trying to do calculations of probabilities in the multiverse. And this is an attempt to say the laws of physics, which are fine-tuned for our existence, have come about because in the multiverse, everywhere physics varies in different parts of the multiverse. And in most parts of the multiverse, physics will not allow life to exist. The cosmological constant will be too long, or the gravitational force too great, electromagnetic force too weak or something. But there will be pockets in the multiverse where things just happen to come out right, and life will exist in those pockets. That hypothesis is an attractive explanatory proposal, and you'll find it in books, many books. For instance, my colleague Martin Rees, I think it's put in the Stephen Hawking's new book. But it's not testable physics. Now, I'm fighting a battle with my colleagues about this because some of them are trying to say it is testable. They're trying to say this is very good science. We propose a multiverse, that's a scientific explanation, and this provides you a reason why the universe, although it looks improbable, actually it's probable. Well, I think they're stretching the nature of science when they say that. I think that it's not testable physics means it's not actually science. I think it's philosophy. Now, there's nothing wrong with philosophy, but you must label philosophy as being philosophy. And my colleagues, either explicitly or implicitly, are trying to say this is a scientific explanation and therefore it has to be the truth. In fact, Brian Greene has just brought out a book called The Hidden Reality, in which he talks about 9 different types of multiverses. You may have seen this. And Brian Greene is a big name in the public science game. The first printing of this book is 300,000 copies. Okay. And I've just written a review of this in Nature, in which I've said this is a nice book, but the title is wrong. This is not a hidden reality, it is a hypothesis about a hidden reality. And I think it's really important for people who want to be careful about explanation and testing our theories that we tell ourselves, the multiverse, it's a nice philosophical explanation, it is not a testable scientific theory in the ordinary sense of testing. We could talk about that. In any case, supposing the multiverse was to exist, supposing we say, let's put those doubts aside, so there's a multiverse. Well, it doesn't solve the issue of ultimate causation in any way. Because the whole issue of probability arises as regards the multiverse. Well, why does this multiverse exist and not another one? Who decided that this multiverse would come into existence? Well, there are super laws of physics which make the multiverse. Well, where did those laws come from? All you do is postpone the ultimate questions. In fact, it leads to a spectre of infinite regress, because I can easily conjure up for you a multiverse in which no universes allow life to exist. It's quite easy to do that. We can have a multiverse in which every universe allows life to exist. We can have ones in which some do and some don't. Why does the multiverse allow life to exist? Well, if you take it one step back and says, well, of course, there was an ensemble of multiverses, a multiverse of multiverses, and you have the spectra of infinite regress, where you're playing the probability of a specific multiverse by assuming an ensemble of multiverses. Well, the unique universe that actually exists may well not be probable. In fact, there is no proof that the universe is probable, and in fact, I think it's clear it is not probable. You try to make it probable by creating a multiverse. It's a plausible philosophical explanation. It's a possible one. You then have to ask yourself, so where did the laws creating the multiverse come from? Where do they exist? In what kind of space did they exist? And who decided what they would be? And you haven't solved the problem of ultimate causation in any way. The one which physicists hoped would work is necessity, that there's only one logically possible set of physics. And if we could understand it deep enough, we would say, I've been trying to say in the multiverse physics could be different in the different parts. The alternative view is to say that's not right. Physics has to be the way it is, and there's no other way it could be. Now, this is the very, very attractive for theoretical physicists. In fact, that's what they've been trying to do, but they have failed. They have failed miserably. And they produce the stringy theory landscape of possibilities, which is huge numbers of possibilities instead of a unique theory. But if it could work, let us just suppose it could work. Supposing there was a theoretical physics explanation. There's certain symmetry principles. There's a group called SU10 or a group called EH which governs theoretical physics interactions and governs the nature of particles and the interaction between particles. And supposing you could say there's only one logically possible such theory, which we haven't got, but let's suppose you could. That wouldn't solve the problem, because what it would mean, it would make it a deeper problem. It would mean that in some sense or other, these abstract variation principles and symmetries allow life to exist and allow our brains to come to existence. In a certain sense, it would say the possibility of our brains is written into these abstract mathematical structures. Now that's an extraordinary statement. And I think actually if you ever could provide such a proof, it would make the mystery of the existence of life much deeper mystery. In fact, I think the multiverse explanation is a much more plausible one. In any case, as I've said, this doesn't seem to work because at the moment theoretical physics is going the other way. Instead of converging on a unique one, in fact it's diverging into billions and billions and billions of possibilities. The hope for uniqueness of fundamental theories has evaporated and be replaced by the multiple billions of possibilities of string vacua according to our latest quantum gravity theories. In any case, the attempt to implement necessity leaves unexplained the choice of those specific realized features that lead to necessity. Because supposing you could say, I've got this theory of physics, it's based in certain symmetry principles and variation principles, and it's unique. Where did you find the laws that tell you that this is unique? And you end up back with exactly the same questions. If you could say it was unique, how did it come about that there was some higher level of argumentation that could tell you this was the only way that things would be? So you don't solve the fundamental problems. Why should physics have the specific nature that leads to these particular high level features being necessary given the nature of physics? What you have to explain, where do the very causal categories of chance, necessity and purpose come from? You're assuming ideas of chance, of necessity and purpose. Where did those come from? Do they pre-exist the universe? Do they come into being with the universe or what? How do these concepts arise and have meaning? And what underlying ontological entities or causation do they represent? Is there some higher level of causation which causes the laws of physics to come into being? Why are these themselves necessary? You end up in a kind of a logical loop there. How do you prove the necessity of necessity? Okay. How can they even be relevant, as this discussion supposes, if there's no ontological referent that makes the dichotomy between these meaningful? In other words, all of these discussions presume the existence of some metaphysical existence where the bases are laid down from which you can start all the further bits of argumentation. And you never found this discussed in all of these papers and books. Stephen Hawking's book doesn't discuss any of this kind of thing. The final possibility of these four ultimate possibilities, let's just remember what they were. What we had was pure chance, we had probability, we had necessity, and the final one is purpose. Given the total different quality of existence and emergence in human life from the underlying physics, the huge fine-tuning that is needed for this to occur, maybe there's an underlying intentional purpose that has created this fine-tuning. An underlying intentional purpose that this should indeed be the case is a possible fundamental option. It was meant to be that way. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't probability, it wasn't inevitability, it was chosen, in some sense, to be that way. And in causation, in the world about us, we've got the bottom level causation, which is the physics level, but at the top level we have and we know that causation in terms of purpose exists. And what has been happening in this cosmological argument is we've been following the physicists and saying, well, let's extrapolate that bottom level causation, the purposeless functioning of physical, let's say that that is the foundation thing. But we know in the universe that intention does exist. And maybe we should understand the cosmos better by saying that is the thing which we should pursue as what underlies the cosmos, rather than those meaningless laws algorithmically grinding away without any sense or reason or purpose. If this was the case, if the laws have been fine-tuned in some sense, something has caused them to be the way which would make life come into existence. There's an underlying higher level set of purposive principles, an underlying telos that is the ultimate cause, both of existence and its specific nature. And of course this relates to spiritual or religious views of the nature of reality, supported by a variety of evidence relative to those domains. It is unlike, supposing you wanted to create a universe in which meaning could come into existence, in which individuals could come into existence who could have meaning in their minds. Supposing you say, I want to create a universe in which physical processes will lead to the existence of individuals with purpose, meaning in their minds. It's unlikely this kind of underlying intention could be effective without the emergence of a physical structure whose purpose can be meaningfully deployed so that ethical behavior is meaningful. In other words, unless, on the one hand, the lower level laws have the kind of impersonal regular behavior that allows reliable higher level behavior to emerge, and thus allows a mathematical description. If you want complex life to come into existence in a universe, you'd better have reliable lower level laws. And they'd better be reliable enough that you can describe them mathematically. And you also want something like quantum uncertainty at the low level, so that there isn't an iron grip of determinism from the bottom, so that there is a certain freedom in what happens, which will allow the higher levels to have some causal efficacy. Thus, implementing this proposal, this idea of purpose underlying it, can in a sense invoke the other two. Meaning of purpose entails both necessity and chance. Each of these kinds of causation, chance in the sense of probability, necessity and purpose. Chance, each of these kinds of causation, chance in the sense of probability and necessity and purpose, does indeed occur in the world at various contexts. We've seen them all in the world around us. The only deep one that seems to entail the possibility of being a deep foundation for the others is purpose. Because if you want to make purpose happen, you've got to build in chance and you've got to build in necessity. A degree of necessity, not ultimate necessity, but a degree. Thus, an underlying intention or purpose that this should indeed be the case, that complex life could exist, life that can have moral feelings, that's a possible fundamental option, indeed offering the very ground out of which they themselves can come into existence. If, on this view, the core of being is that the underlying ultimate purpose of everything relates to meaning and morality, and one can argue that this purpose is, as identified by the spiritual traditions of all the major world religions, unselfish love. And Sir John Templeton wrote a very nice little book on this called Agape Love, showing how the spiritual element of all the world religions does indeed believe in unselfish love, what he calls agape love. In this case, if this was the case, a layered structure would emerge. Purpose at the bottom level, underlying the laws of physics, underlies impersonal laws which are decreed by that underlying purpose. That then, those impersonal laws are structured in such a way that life can come to existence, allowing emergence of purpose again at a higher level. So the two kinds of causation we're familiar with, intentional on one and impersonal on the other, they both exist in the world around us. They would occur in an intertwined way, with chance events intervening and helping to lead to the richness of outcomes we see around us. So that's the kind of picture one can have of what might be. So I've taken you through the 4 possible fundamental reasons, and I've made the proposal that the last one is in many ways the most sensible one, because otherwise it's almost impossible to see how the kind of existence we represent, with feelings, morality, love, pain, the whole thing, how could they emerge unless in some sense they were designed to emerge? This is nothing but, in a sense, the good old design argument, but in a modern context. Well, what kind of evidence is relevant? What I want to say is, when we discuss this, we need to take data from the whole of life, not just physics or astronomy. And you'll find all of these books talking about the nature of the universe, acting as if you only need to take data from physics and astronomy. Now that's ludicrous. We are part of the universe, we live in it. If you're dealing with ultimate meaning, therefore what is relevant to human life, you've got to talk about whatever seems to give ultimate meaning to life. You can't ignore those parts of what happens in the world at which our deepest feelings occur and say that's not evidence. It is evidence about the nature of the universe, just as much as what physicists discover and what astronomers discover is evidence about the universe. There is indeed purpose in the universe. You came here because you wanted to hear a talk. That's purpose. We are here to understand the nature of the universe a bit better. Either purpose emerges out of nothing, or it's there from the start as the foundation and then is reflected in life. And the claim that meaning and purpose can emerge out of nothing is a very difficult one when you really start thinking about it. So the idea that there is an underlying purpose to the whole thing is certainly as a possibility for ultimate causation. How's my time going?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, well then I better wrap up for you. I just want to say one doesn't have to only take into account the physics, the chemistry, the astronomy. One can also take what I call intimations of transcendence. Ideas you get from morality and ethics, from aesthetics and beauty, from companionship and love, from creativity, which in turn underlies science. The very nature of creation and existence, all of these hint at deeper things and spiritual experiences, however you interpret those. In all of these there's an excess, something more than is necessary, with an underlying unifying kenotic theme. This tries to express this. I say to myself as I watch the niece, who's very beautiful, in her this bread is transmuted into melancholy grace, into modesty, into a gentleness without words. Sensing my gaze, she raised her eyes towards mine and seemed to smile, a mere breath on the delicate face of the waters, but an affecting vision. I sense the mysterious presence of the soul that is unique to this place. It fills me with peace, my mind with the words, "This is the peace of silent realms. I have seen the shining light that is born of the wheat." Is it plausible that that could come out of nothing? Or is it more plausible that this arises because it represents a reflection of something deeper and underlying? I better go through that.
Some stuff in this book. Yeah.
Do you want me to go through that, or shall I? No, time is short. I believe with all my heart and mind there's a spiritual dimension to all being that cannot be encapsulated in scripture or in creed, an essence that loses its creative force when its communication depends upon the use of words alone. It can, I think, be readily made manifest through metaphor and poem or story, yet I'm deeply aware that even when presented in such a form, the truth remains partial. For me, there's a reality that lies beyond our presently misdirected concern for the fruits of economic power. It's only when we acknowledge our deeper inner to discover meaning in the existence that we begin to harvest the fruits of the Spirit. Most of us are at least partially aware of epiphanies that come our way from time to time. The emergence when rounding a corner of a breathtaking panorama of a mountain, forest and ocean, the sudden sensibility of a zephyr breeze rustling treetops, the scent of jasmine on a shower of rain. I believe there are illuminations far beyond these intuitions, insights, divinations that are not shaped by the physical senses. The hand of a friend on one's shoulder in a time of trouble, the sudden recognition of a smile in a passing stranger. Above all, the wondrous inspiration of the serendipity, synchronicity, and innate knowing in the fabric of our lives. More often than not, gifts such as these, which indelibly inscribe themselves upon our memories, are regarded as gifts of God. You may or may not want to take that as evidence. I think the fact that this exists is evidence about the nature of the underlying things. And this is from Parker Palmer. On the cross, our small self dies so that true self, the God self, can emerge. On the cross, we give up the fantasy that we are in control, and the death of this fantasy is central to acceptance. The cross, above all, is the place of powerlessness. Here is the death of the ego, the death of the self that insists on being in charge, the self that is continually attempting to impose its own limited version of order and righteousness on the world. This is the great mystery at the heart of the Christian faith, at the heart of the person of Jesus or Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., the power of powerlessness. Emptiness is a key word describing the appearance of acceptance. Jesus on the cross emptied himself so that God could enter in. You may or may not agree with those specific words, but what I'm saying is that there is a spirit expressed there, which cannot be denied, which does exist. I've just read it to you, you've heard it. It does exist in the world, and if you put that together, it is evidence about the nature of the universe that this exists. So is the ultimate reason pure chance or probability or necessity or purpose? They are all logically possible. Now, the science nor philosophy can give a certain answer. Metaphysical uncertainty remains. And you can defend any of these depending on your philosophical predisposition. However, if one wants to relate to the deeper meaning of personal life, the last option has the most traction. The others in the end provide a more tentative relation to morality and meaning, but we do have experience that these, morality and meaning, do indeed exist. And so I'm saying to you that when you look at the nature of the universe, try to understand that you must take into account the astronomy, the physics, the chemistry, microbiology, all of that, but you should also take into account this, and that also is evidence on the way things are. It should be emphasized, if one takes this stand, it's not a scientific conclusion, nor is the argument presented above one that can be sustained on scientific grounds alone. I have consciously gone into the domain of philosophy. The issues considered here, the nature of ultimate causation, are not amenable to scientific resolution, and any book you are provided which claims they are is simply wrong and is misleading. And there are several of these books which have come out in the past year or two. These issues go beyond the domain where scientific experiments or observations can give a reliable answer. The argument is thus a philosophical or metaphysical one, based securely on current science, but also taking into account wider philosophical and human issues than can be handled by science per se. Any attempt to adequately tackle the fundamental issue considered here will necessarily be of this nature. If one wishes to deal purely in terms of scientific argumentation, then the above will be beyond what one considers a legitimate argument. But if one takes that stand, allowing scientifically rigorous explanation alone, one should carefully refrain from making any statements about issues of ultimate causation. And we've seen several very careless examples of this in recent times, including my old colleague Stephen Hawking. The statements that he's made in there cannot be made legitimately on a purely scientific basis, and one should not pretend one is making a scientific statement when one does so. So you've got the astronomers searching out there for the answer, looking out at the stars beyond and trying to see what has happened. But you've got the humanists there trying to understand, and the task is to put those together in a way which really makes sense as a coherent overall position.
We have some time for questions. I'll ask you to be brief and have George take the forward answer. Yeah, there you go.
George, I'm not a physicist, so there might be a simple answer to this. Are all the laws that physicists formulate reductionistic in character? If they are, then a physicist would never be able to explain divergence or top-down action. Yet here's a qualification. I was thinking about Ilya Prigoghine's complement to the second law of thermodynamics, where in an open system, chaos leads to higher forms of order. Is that a physical judgment, or does he have to appeal to something other than physics to make that observation?
Physicists tend to only look at the bottom-up aspects of causation. That is the way that they tend to think. As you go up the hierarchy of complexity, it becomes more and more difficult to look at that. But in fact, you see, physicists don't often take themselves even into the domain of engineering. As soon as you apply physics in an engineering context, top-down causation dominates what happens. But physicists don't think in those terms. Now, for instance, this computer, what's happening in this computer is based purely on physics. It's interactions, it's quantum tunneling, it's a whole lot of stuff like that. But the outcome depends on the fact that that computer has been engineered in a specific way, and it's that top-down engineering which shapes all the connectivity of the transistors and all the rest of it, which makes it into a computer with a specific output. And so physicists think in a bottom-up way because they tackle problems in that way, and they restrict the problems they consider into those which can be solved that way. And physicists don't deal with engineering problems. Engineers are all the time dealing with top-down. The stuff of emergence, many books have been written about emergence, trying to take the bottom-up view of emergence as far as they can, Prigogine, some of that stuff and so on. By itself, from the bottom up, you can only create very, very limited complexity. You can create sand piles, you can create the Conway game of life and so on like that. That doesn't begin to resemble biological complexity. And so the claim that I will make is that you get certain patterns, flocking of birds, stuff like that, slime mold, things like that, which are very impressive in the paper, but that are not genuine complexity, in my view.
I would like to strongly disagree with you. I was around this area about 45 years ago.
Yeah.
Sir John Polkinghorne was wandering these same streets. We were all working with Jeff Chu on top-down, bottom-up world of physics.
Yeah.
And the magic word was bootstrap. That was Jeff's thing.
Bootstrap program failed.
The bootstrap program failed at that point, but there are many people nowadays who are David Gross, of course, was from that same school, who are string theory came from that. So in a sense, it didn't fail. String theory came directly from the bootstrap of the Berkeley school. I mean, Gelbon won with quarks, of course, but the bootstrap idea is a combination of your number 2 and number 3, which is the probability and the necessity. So that kind of thinking is now alive and well, that it seems to me that how to get these multiverses to be consistently constrained with each other. So the magic word is consistency, and it's very possible, physics hasn't done it yet, but it's very possible that the multiverses will be constrained in a way that's totally compatible with your number 4 purpose. There's something about love that is probably embedded at the bottom, and there's the same consistency that brings you love might constrain the multiple string theories. So when you say it's number 4 purpose, versus, whenever I hear it's either or, I don't see why it can't be both. The same principle, a bootstrap kind of consistency, might do, just like 45 years ago, here in Berkeley, we were doing top-down, bottom-up. It might happen again.
I'm not quite sure what you're disagreeing with.
I'm disagreeing with your either or, that it's either 4 or 2 or 3. It's either...
I see. Okay.
I think the same
Well, in a
top-down consistency constraints is what people are working on now.
Well, okay. At the end of my discussion of 4, I said that 4, in a sense, implied the other ones, which I think is fairly what you're saying. I don't think the string theorists normally think that what they're talking about has got anything to do with love and pain and hate and all that.
Well, they're not educated yet.
And I'm surprised to hear you saying that this is still a bootstrap program, because
Well,
I certainly don't see those phrases used in the current literature.
I agree with that. No, but the people who are playing with string theory, you are correct that the physicists, the present physicists, many of them are not happy with the multiverse, too much freedom, and they are looking for constraints that haven't been found yet.
Yeah.
But that's the big project.
But yeah, all right, but let me step back. In a sense, I said that, but maybe I should rephrase that. Certainly, I'm talking about ultimate explanation. And by ultimate explanation, you would say you can have 2, 3, and 4. You could have necessity and probability and purpose.
That's correct.
Okay, well that is modifying what you mean by an ultimate. If necessity is ultimate, then there's only necessity. If there's something else, necessity isn't the ultimate; it's part of the ultimate. So, and the same for the probability. If you say it's 2, 3, and 4, if you're including 4, I would see the others as being there, but being outcomes of the 4. That's what I would say.
Well, the bootstrappers would say there's some principle which might be feeling like love.
Yeah.
There's some principle that has not been found yet. Some deeper principle
Okay.
by which, because of self-consistency, it's going to all work out.
Okay, well, a few days ago in Texas, I saw Stephen Weinberg. I don't think he'd agree with what you're phrasing.
Other hands?
Yeah.
Is there any physics that would say that it's not possible for the physical laws themselves to emerge?
There are many conjectures that the laws are emergent, and in fact, at a certain level, we know that the laws are emergent. There are effective laws. In fact, a lot of physics is to do with effective laws, which are emergent laws. And so, for instance, Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism emerge out of underlying quantum field theory, and so on and so on. So in fact, much of the attempt of present-day physics is to say that there's a set of foundational laws, and then most of the ones which we are familiar with are emergent. Some of them are obviously emergent, like the second law of thermodynamics. Yes, but the position which I've been trying to put earlier on is in that hierarchy, even if they're emergent, at the level where they operate, they are real laws which should be considered as real laws at that level, even though they are emergent from underlying levels.
Thank you.
You mentioned a bunch of times that the laws of physics are the same everywhere, and that matter behaves the same way. And I'm wondering if it seems as if a lot of matter is unaccounted for, something
A lot of matter is?
unaccounted for, isn't
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah.
Then it seems like that's an assumption that if we were to relax that assumption, would that allow us to perhaps come up with a system that is more consistent with how much matter we actually have? Is there specific experiments that would tell us that matter is the same everywhere, or is that just an assumption?
People have played with variations of the laws of physics. For instance, it may be that dark matter is because Newton's theory is wrong, that you need to modify Newton's theory. There's a whole thing called modified Newtonian dynamics which tries to explain that. At another level, it might be, for instance, people have experimented with the idea that the gravitational constant doesn't changes with time, which in a certain sense that the laws are more flexible than you first thought. But in order to turn that into a scientific theory, you then have to put forward a hypothesis what determines how the gravitational constant varies, and then that law is then a universal law. And you have to have a set of universal laws which from which effective laws derive. Now, string theory actually works that way. You have a set of underlying laws which are fixed, and from which apparently different laws can emerge at the lower levels, but they're all emerging out of a fixed underlying basis. So in a sense, the whole concept of the laws of physics has to be that there's a fixed underlying thing. You may have got the level at which it's fixed wrong at a first stage, but then you go to a higher level and you have a fixed set. The evidence is distant astronomical observations. For instance, there's a very simple one. We currently are measuring microwave background radiation with a Planck spectrum to unbelievable accuracy. That proves that quantum physics held exactly the same 14 billion years ago as it does today, for instance. And so that's incredible evidence that the fact we're receiving black body radiation from the sky at 3 degrees Kelvin, it proves that physics was the same 300 years, 1,000 years after the Big Bang as it is today.
Any last question?
I just wanted to know, what were these books that you mentioned that you disagreed with? You said that they were going on there.
There's a book called The Hidden Reality by Brian Greene, and there's a book by Stephen Hawking whose title I forget. It's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the latest Stephen Hawking book in which he says that the universe the laws of physics can create the universe out of nothing, and therefore there's no place for a religious explanation or words like that. It's Hawking and...
Mladenau.
What?
Mladenau.
Well, I don't know, yeah.
Okay, before we thank George, remind you again, if you want to have more information about CPS, please see Kyle in the back. Take a look at the books for sale.
Sure.
Thanks for coming, and George, thank you for a while.